So, big surprise, apparently the Russian Space Agency is not a huge fan of the Artemis moon landing program and would rather prefer to side with China instead of working together with the US. So will this lead to the establishment of a Chinese-Russian moon base? Then the NASA Inspector General has released a highly interesting report on the Orion spacecraft. And guess what they found? NASA is not being transparent about the Orion spacecraft.
A shocker, we know. But at least we now have a date for the SLS static fire tests. And yes, it won't be too soon. Oh, now we also have the definitive launch date for the James Webb Space Telescope. And lastly, as always, we will analyze the current progress of Starship at Boca Chica. So when finally static fire and hoping.
Rogozin, what would we do without you? This guy is always good for some fun and highly entertaining remarks. It's by the way the same guy that back in 2014 said, quote, "After analyzing the sanctions against our space industry, I suggest to the USA to bring their astronauts to the International Space Station using a trampoline." Which explains Elon's quite hilarious remark after the successful launch of the Demo 2 mission, where he famously exclaimed on Twitter, "The trampoline is working." At least Rogozin had the humor and said that he loved the joke. But around the same time, he made some other quite bizarre remarks about which we talked in this video here. In short, he implied that SpaceX is able to offer such low prices compared to other space launch providers because they are being subsidized by the US government. Nothing could be further from the truth. The companies that are being subsidized are certainly not companies like SpaceX, but more companies like Boeing or Lockheed or Northrop Grumman, first and foremost of course Boeing, who are being kept alive by pumping billions of dollars of taxpayer money into their outdated and old-fashioned products. You could actually say that SpaceX is being anti-subsidized.
Rogozin should have known that the reason why SpaceX is so much cheaper than the others is reusability. They are the only ones reusing their rockets, which of course allows them to offer a ride to the ISS for $40 million per astronaut, which is about half of what the Russians are asking for. And yes, Boeing is actually asking even more than the Russians, $90 million per seat compared to their $86 million price tag. The awkward moment when the Russians have friendlier prices for NASA than an American company. So anyways, Rogozin has truly established himself as a guy who makes some quite bizarre but also highly entertaining remarks. And he thought, why not make another entertaining remark? Rogozin said last week during an interview on the 5th anniversary of the establishment of Roscosmos as a state corporation on the topic of a cooperation between Russia and the US on joint moon missions. Quote, "For the United States, this is now more of a political project. With the lunar project, we are observing the departure of our American partners from the principles of cooperation and mutual support that have developed in cooperation with the ISS. They see their program not as international, but as similar to NATO. There is America. Everyone else must help and pay. Honestly, we are not interested in participating in such a project." Rogozin said that instead working together with the US on joint crewed missions to the moon, he prefers working together with China, adding that Roscosmos has now taken the first steps of cooperating on a lunar scientific base. He further said that China is now considered as a worthy partner for cooperation, apparently more so than the US. So what does that mean for our future moon bases? Well, the joint forces of the new Reds and the ex-Reds suffice to establish a moon base before the United States can establish their own moon base with the Artemis program? Well, to answer this question, we should first look at some financials. Roscosmos is in a really bad position, and SpaceX is actually totally destroying their revenue. as can be seen on this chart here. We've argued in this video here why we believe that Roscosmos is completely done for, and they will just be kept alive by Russian taxpayer money. But they won't be able to compete with SpaceX in any way, which is by the way also true for the other space launch providers.
And if you happen to like this video despite our admittedly weird accents, we'd be super happy and thankful if you would subscribe to stay up to date with the latest news on spaceflight and a heavy emphasis on space politics, but also on disruptive technologies. So Roscosmos currently has an annual budget of $2.77 billion. The Chinese Space Agency has an annual budget of $11 billion. So together, they would have $13.77 billion annually at their disposal. As a comparison, NASA's annual budget for this year is $22.5 billion, so almost twice as much. However, we unfortunately also know that NASA isn't exactly spending that money very efficiently, about which we'll talk more later in detail. And China, by the way, has plans to land on the moon by 2030. If they manage to channel their resources more efficiently, and the Russians would add about $1 billion annually into the project, it could be possible for them to land on the moon around 2030 and establish a joint moon base in the early 2030s. China even already has their own capsule for deep space missions, which looks suspiciously like SpaceX's Dragon. Well, at least Red Dragon has happened in some form, even though it's a different form than we would have liked. Anyways, the Artemis plan is to land on the moon already by 2024, which now seems honestly quite unlikely, as we argued in last week's video, because it seems that NASA won't have the necessary funds to build the moon landers soon enough for a 2024 landing. And we argued that it is very likely that the administration by 2024 might actually cancel the Artemis program altogether, which would be a fatal mistake, since Russia and China could then land on the moon uncontested by 2030.
But even should Artemis get cancelled, we think China and Russia, even combining the power of the ex-Soviets and the neo-Soviets, would stand no chance. For there is one mightier than them, SpaceX, of course. With or without NASA, with or without Artemis, it is our strongest belief that SpaceX will land astronauts on the moon in this decade and do the other things, and return them safely back to Earth. Not because it is easy, but because it is hard, and because it serves as a perfect exercise for future Mars missions, which, as we know, is Elon's real target. And the lunar starships are, as we often said, giant moon bases themselves. Let a few of them on the moon, and you already have a huge moon base, far larger and far superior to anything the Soviets, the Russians and the Chinese could ever build. So it will be SpaceX and no other who will ensure that America, good old America, will first have a moon base, and that a red moon will be averted.
And why won't NASA be most likely the ones bringing us back to the moon? We mentioned before that even though they have almost twice the space budget as China and Russia combined, they spend their money not really efficiently. Because if they would do so, they would just give a few billion annually to SpaceX and we'd have a moon base in 2 years. Instead, we know that they are obliged by US Congress, so by politics, to fund giant wasteful projects such as SLS and Orion because they need to subsidize inefficient companies such as Boeing, Lockheed and Northrop, the prime contractors for the mentioned spacecraft systems. And if you think that we make stuff up or exaggerate, okay, we might exaggerate sometimes, but still, this is now basically being confirmed by the latest report of NASA's Inspector General. A link, of course, in the description. By its calculations, NASA is excluding $17.5 billion from what it calls the tailored estimate of $12.2 billion in NASA uses. The report also lays out the program's many schedule delays. So how exactly is NASA cheating on Orion, which is, by the way, built by Lockheed? Well, they found that NASA's cost estimate for Orion of $12.2 billion doesn't include the $6.3 billion already spent on it during the Constellation program. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, that's how old the Orion spacecraft actually is. It dates back all the way to 2006. 14 years! Just compare that to where SpaceX was 14 years ago. Just compare that to where SpaceX was 14 years ago.
NASA also excludes $10 billion in production costs and another $1 billion for development costs beyond Artemis 2 and other costs, whatever that might be. So the Inspector General found that the total cost for this small capsule here until around 2030 would be, grab your seats, ladies and gentlemen, $29.5 billion. Almost $30 billion for this small capsule here. With that money, SpaceX would have already built as 5 moon bases and 2 Mars bases. This is exactly the reason why on this channel here, we are always so brutal to companies like Lockheed or Boeing, because they consume giant amounts of money without giving us back much in return. Very contrary to SpaceX, who consume very little money and already give us huge things in return, such as reusable rockets, and soon also Starlink, and later even Starship. We hope that this report will open the eyes to many, and hopefully lead to a change in the spending culture of NASA. And talking about the devil, the static fire tests for SLS have now been fixed for October this year. But don't hold your breath, because the first uncrewed test flight of Orion aboard SLS will take place in late 2021. This will be the Artemis 1 mission, which will foresee an uncrewed flight of Orion around the moon, which has been delayed by the way. It should have already flown later this year. But hey, Lockheed and Boeing need a few billion more from NASA. We hope you understand that, so don't be too harsh on them. Another thing that is being delayed again is the James Webb Space Telescope. Now the new launch date is October 2021. Let's hope that this time it won't be delayed again, because this is really starting to become a running gag. And why is James Webb so important? We talked about it, for example, in this video here.
And finally, some updates from Boca Chica. Let's analyze what's happening there. So SN5 is still waiting for the static fire test before it can finally perform the 150-meter hopping test. Current road closure dates aren't really helpful because it can basically happen every day now. So we'll just have to wait and see and hope that it will finally happen soon. Meanwhile, work is continuing on the Super Heavy High Bay assembly building, and the nose cone for the first time since Mark 1 has been assembled to the upper body section. In this amazing shot by Boca Chica gal, link to NASA Spaceflight's channel is by the way in the description, we can see the impressive difference in build quality between the upper section of the Mk1 and this latest one on the right. The welds are much smoother, as well as the steel surface itself. It seems much more robust and smoother than the wrinkled Mk1 steel surface. A new launch mount for the Starship is also being built, while the launch pad for Super Heavy is now also much further along, since the rebar pillars are now all buried deep into the ground, as can be seen here. We are really curious about Super Heavy launching from this launch pad here. It will be certainly a sight to behold, but you should better bring earplugs along for the launch. And should the tensions between China and the US continue to rise, we talked a potential military version of Starship in this video here.
So thanks for watching the JS Space Report, and I'd say on to the future. The 5th anniversary of the establishment of Roscosmos?
Ja,